June 14, 2017. North Kensington, London. At 12:54 a.m., a single flame changed everything. What began as a small kitchen fire in a fourth-floor flat became an inferno that consumed a 24-story tower in less than an hour. The building burned like a torch against the London sky, its newly installed cladding acting as kindling. 72 people died that night. Men, women, children, entire families. Some made calls for help that would never come. Others were told to stay put in apartments that became their tombs. The fire climbed the outside of the building faster than anyone inside could escape it. When dawn broke over West London, Grenfell Tower stood as a blackened shell, a monument to failure, greed, and the lives deemed expendable. So, how could something like this happen in one of the wealthiest boroughs in the world? Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We love seeing our global audience and how this story reaches people around the world. Before the fire, Grenfell Tower was home. A concrete pillar, rising above the Lancaster West Estate in North Kensington, it had stood since 1974, part of Britain's post-war promise to house the working class. 129 flats stacked into the sky, each one a universe unto itself. This was not a place of luxury, it was a place of survival, of resilience, of community forged in cramped corridors and shared struggles. The tower housed teachers, taxi drivers, cleaners, students, refugees who had fled war zones, only to find themselves in another kind of danger. They were Eritrean, Syrian, Moroccan, Italian, British, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs. The kind of diversity that politicians praised in speeches but ignored in policy. From the outside, Grenfell looked renewed. In 2016, after years of complaints from residents, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea had funded a refurbishment. £8.6 million spent on new windows, new heating, and most notably, new exterior cladding. The building gleamed now, wrapped in panels of cream and charcoal that caught the light. To the developers and the council, it was an aesthetic upgrade, a way to make social housing more palatable to the wealthy neighborhoods that surrounded it. To the residents, it was lipstick on a crumbling structure. The lift still broke down. The fire alarms were incomplete. The single stairwell remained the only escape route. But no one with power listened to the people who lived there. The residents of Grenfell had been sounding alarms for years, not metaphorical ones. Real, desperate warnings. In 2013, the Grenfell Action Group, a small collective of tenants, began documenting every failure, every danger, every ignored plea. They wrote blog posts with titles that now read like prophecies. Playing with fire, they warned in 2016. It is a truly terrifying thought, but the Grenfell Action Group firmly believe that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord. They detailed blocked fire exits, broken fire doors, exposed wiring, and the contractor's disregard for safety. The council threatened them with legal action for defamation. The management company dismissed them as troublemakers. And so, the tower stood, beautiful on the outside, rotting from within. A powder keg, waiting for a spark. Among those who called Grenfell home was Khadija Sai, 24 years old, an artist on the cusp of recognition. Her photographs had just been accepted into the Venice Biennale, a dream for any young creator. She lived on the 20th floor with her mother Mary Mendy. Khadija was gentle, thoughtful, full of quiet determination. Her work explored identity, displacement, and the experience of being a young black woman in London. She used her art to tell the stories others overlooked. That Tuesday night, June 13th, she posted on social media about her excitement for Venice. She was packing, preparing. The future felt open and bright. By dawn she and her mother would be gone, trapped in their flat as the smoke thickened and the flames closed in. Her last messages to friends were pleas for help that would never arrive in time. On the 14th floor lived Mohammed Al-Haj Ali, a Syrian refugee who had fled the civil war in 2014. He was 23, studying engineering, dreaming of rebuilding what war had destroyed. He had survived barrel bombs and airstrikes, only to die in a tower block in one of the safest cities on earth. His brother escaped. Mohammed did not. His family would later say that he called them as the fire spread, his voice calm, telling them not to worry. He was found weeks later, identified by dental records. Dennis Murphy, a 68-year-old Irishman, lived on the 14th floor as well. He was a familiar face around the estate, always ready with a joke, a cup of tea, a listening ear. He had lived in Grenfell for 35 years. It was his home in every sense of the word. When the fire broke out, neighbors heard him helping others evacuate, knocking on doors, guiding people toward the stairs. His body was found later near the stairwell. He had died doing what he had always done, looking after his community. There was also the Choucair family. Nadia, her husband Bassem, and their 3 daughters Mirna, Fatima, and Zainab. They lived on the 22nd floor. Nadia's mother Seria lived with them. 6 members of one family, wiped out in a single night. Bassem was an accomplished academic. Nadia was a devoted mother. The girls were bright, playful, full of life. That evening they had gathered for dinner, laughing over a meal. Hours later they were gone. The youngest, Zainab, was only 3 years old. The tower was full of such stories. Gloria Trevisan and Marco Gottardi, a young Italian couple who had just moved to London, their whole lives ahead of them. Zainab Dean, a 2-month-old baby. Esla Elguari, who called emergency services repeatedly, begging for help that never came. Isaac Paulos, a 5-year-old boy who loved dinosaurs. Each name, a universe. Each loss, immeasurable. But Grenfell was not just a collection of individuals, it was a community. Residents organized events, looked after each other's children, shared food during Ramadan. The boxing club on the ground floor was a lifeline for local kids, keeping them off the streets, giving them discipline and hope. The estate had its problems, poverty, overcrowding, neglect, but it also had something rare in a city as vast and cold as London. It had solidarity. People knew their neighbors. They fought together for better conditions, for repairs, for respect. That solidarity would be tested in the most horrific way imaginable. The warning signs were everywhere, if anyone with power had cared to look. Grenfell Tower was a case study in systemic neglect. It had been built in the 1970s during an era when Britain was racing to address a housing shortage. Speed and cost efficiency mattered more than quality. The tower, like many others, was constructed with a single staircase. A design flaw that would prove fatal. In the event of a fire, there was only one way out. If that route became impassable, residents were trapped. For decades, fire safety experts had warned about this. They had called for sprinkler systems in high-rise buildings, for multiple escape routes, for regular safety drills. But retrofitting old towers was expensive. Councils across Britain ignored the warnings. Grenfell had no sprinklers. It had no central fire alarm system that could alert all residents simultaneously. It had no external fire escape. The official fire safety strategy was called Stay Put. In the event of a fire, residents were told to remain in their flats, close the doors and wait for firefighters. The logic was simple. Each flat was supposed to be a self-contained fire-resistant box. If a fire started in one, it should not spread to others. The building was designed to compartmentalize the blaze. But that logic depended on one critical assumption, that the building was properly maintained. Grenfell was not. Over the years, fire doors had been left broken, communal areas had been cluttered with rubbish, gas pipes ran through the building in ways that violated safety codes. And then came the refurbishment. In 2016, the tower was wrapped in a new skin, aluminum composite material, or ACM, cladding panels with a polyethylene core. These panels were cheap, lightweight, and aesthetically pleasing. They were also combustible. The version installed on Grenfell had been banned for use on tall buildings in several countries, including Germany and the United States. But in Britain, regulations were looser. Cost-cutting was prioritized. Behind the cladding, a layer of insulation was added. It too was flammable. Between the insulation and the cladding, a small gap was left for ventilation. That gap would act as a chimney, allowing fire to race up the building's exterior at terrifying speed. The residents had questioned the refurbishment. They had asked about fire safety. They were told not to worry. The work was signed off by building inspectors. The contractors assured everyone that it met regulations. But regulations, as it turned out, were woefully inadequate. The Grenfell Action Group had been relentless. They had written to the council, to the management company, to local politicians. They had documented every hazard. They had warned repeatedly that the building was a death trap. In November 2016, just 7 months before the fire, they published a blog post predicting that only an incident that results in serious loss of life would force the authorities to act. They were dismissed as alarmists. Paranoid. Difficult. The Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea was one of the wealthiest councils in Europe. It had a budget surplus of nearly £300 million, yet it refused to spend money on fire safety upgrades. When the refurbishment company, Ryden, proposed using a more fire-resistant cladding, the council rejected it. It would have cost an extra £5,000. £5,000 to save 72 lives. The culture of contempt ran deep. Kensington was a borough of stark contrasts. Streets lined with multi-million-pound townhouses sat minutes away from social housing estates. The wealthy and the poor lived side by side, but in entirely different worlds. The council's priorities reflected this divide. Millions were spent on subterranean extensions for luxury homes. Tens of thousands were spent on noise complaints from opera performances in Holland Park. But the lifts in Grenfell Tower were left to break down for weeks at a time. Elderly and disabled residents climbed 20 floors in darkness. Mothers carried prams up endless staircases. Complaints were ignored, deflected, or met with hostility. There was also Edward Daffon, a resident of Grenfell, and one of the most vocal members of the action group. He lived on the 16th floor and had been documenting the building's failings for years. In 2015, a fire broke out in his flat due to faulty wiring. The fire brigade arrived quickly, but Edward was horrified by what he saw. The fire had spread into the communal hallway with ease. The fire doors had not held. He filed an official complaint, demanding a full safety inspection. The management company, the Tenant Management Organization, or TMO, dismissed his concerns. They accused him of being obstructive. Edward did not stop. He continued writing, recording, protesting. On the night of the fire, Edward escaped, but he was haunted by survivor's guilt, by the knowledge that he had been right all along, and that no one had listened. The night of June 13, 2017, was warm and quiet. The kind of early summer evening when London slows down, when people linger in parks and gardens, savoring the fading light. Inside Grenfell Tower, life carried on as usual. Families cooked dinner. Children finished homework. Shift workers prepared for night jobs. The tower hummed with the ordinary rhythms of life. On the 4th floor, in flat 16, Bahalu Kibede returned home just before midnight. He was a taxi driver, an Eritrean refugee, who had lived in the building for years. He made himself something to eat, and turned on his fridge freezer. Then he went to bed. Sometime around 12:50 a.m., Bahalu woke to the smell of smoke. His fridge freezer was on fire. Flames were spreading across his kitchen. He tried to fight it with water, but it was too late. The fire was growing. He ran out of his flat, shouting for help, pounding on neighbors' doors. He called 999. The fire brigade was dispatched at 12:54 a.m. The first engines arrived within 6 minutes, an impressive response time. The firefighters entered the building, expecting a routine flat fire. They brought hoses, breathing apparatus, the standard equipment. What they found was anything but routine. By the time they reached the 4th floor, the fire had already breached the flat. But worse, it had found a way out of the building. Through the kitchen window, flames had licked upward, catching on the newly installed cladding. Within minutes, the exterior of the tower was alight. The fire did not spread through the inside of the building, as fires normally do. It raced up the outside, leaping from floor to floor with horrifying speed. The cladding panels and insulation acted as fuel. The gap between them acted as a flue. Grenfell Tower was burning from the outside in. Inside, residents began to wake to the smell of smoke, to the sound of shouting, to the glow of orange light outside their windows. Many called 999. The operators, following official guidance, told them to stay put. Close your doors. Seal the gaps with towels. Help is coming. For many, that advice was a death sentence. The stay-put policy, designed for a building where fire could not spread, was catastrophically wrong for a building wrapped in flammable material. But the firefighters on the ground did not yet know what they were dealing with. They did not know that the fire was moving faster than they could climb. They did not know that the building's design was fundamentally flawed. By 1 a.m., the fire had reached the 10th floor. By 1:15, it had reached the 15th. Residents trapped on upper floors began to realize that help was not coming fast enough. They made desperate phone calls. Some called loved ones to say goodbye. Others called 999 again and again, pleading for instructions. The emergency call logs would later reveal the full horror. Voices calm at first, then panicked, then resigned. People trapped in bathrooms, bedrooms, hallways. People describing the smoke getting thicker, the heat becoming unbearable. Operators, doing their best, repeating the same advice. Stay where you are, keep the door closed, firefighters are on their way. But the firefighters were struggling. The single staircase was filling with thick, toxic smoke. Visibility was near zero. The heat was intense. They moved floor by floor, rescuing those they could reach, but the building was vast, and the fire was everywhere. Some residents, ignoring the stay put advice, tried to escape on their own. Many succeeded. They stumbled down the smoke-filled stairs, helping neighbors, carrying children, emerging into the night coughing and crying. But others, trusting the official guidance, stayed in their flats, and waited. And waited, and waited. On the 20th floor, Khadija Say and her mother Mary called friends and family. Khadija posted on Facebook, asking for prayers. She described the smoke, the fear, the sense of being trapped. Her friends tried calling emergency services on her behalf, trying to get through, trying to get help. But the lines were overwhelmed. Hundreds of calls were coming in. The control room was in chaos. On the 14th floor, Mohammed Al-Hajj Ali called his family in Syria. He told them he was scared, but that he would be okay. He recorded a video on his phone, documenting the smoke filling his flat, the sound of people screaming outside. That video would later be used as evidence in the inquiry. Dennis Murphy was seen by several survivors helping people evacuate. He moved through the smoke-filled corridors, knocking on doors, urging people to leave. Some listened, others stayed, trusting the advice they had been given. Dennis made it to the stairwell but collapsed. The smoke was too thick, the heat too great. By 1:30 a.m., the fire had engulfed the entire tower. Every floor above the 10th was burning. The cladding glowed like molten lava. Burning debris rained down onto the streets below. The heat was so intense that windows in nearby buildings began to crack. Residents of surrounding blocks were evacuated, watching in horror as their neighbor's home became a funeral pyre. The firefighters fought with everything they had. Over 200 of them would be deployed that night. One of the largest firefighting operations in London's history. They climbed into smoke and heat that would kill most people within minutes. They carried people out on their backs. They performed CPR on the pavement. They worked until their oxygen tanks ran dry, then went back in anyway. But the building was defeating them. The fire had spread too fast. The staircase was impassable in places. The water pressure was too low to fight a fire on the upper floors. Some firefighters reached the top floors and found families huddled together, still alive, still hoping. But there was no way to get them out. Zainab El-Ghwari, a 55-year-old woman who lived with her mother on the 23rd floor, made a series of desperate calls. For over an hour, she begged for help. She was told to stay put. She was told firefighters were coming. They never reached her. Her last call was at 2:35 a.m. By then, the 23rd floor was an inferno. Zainab and her mother, Elpa, died together. Across the city, people woke to the news. At first it seemed like a terrible but containable incident. A fire in a tower block. Surely everyone had been evacuated. But as the hours passed and the images spread, the truth became clear. This was not a rescue operation. This was a recovery mission. By dawn, the fire was still burning. Grenfell Tower stood as a blackened skeleton, smoke pouring from its empty windows. The streets below were filled with survivors wrapped in blankets, their faces blank with shock. Makeshift relief centers sprang up in churches and community halls. Volunteers arrived with water, food, clothes. The boxing club that had operated on Grenfell's ground floor became a hub for donations. People from across London brought what they could. There was an outpouring of solidarity, of grief, of rage. Because even in those first hours, before the final death toll was known, everyone understood. This should never have happened. This was not an accident. This was a crime. The sun rose over West London on June 14th, but it brought no relief. Grenfell Tower continued to smoulder, a charred monument visible for miles. Smoke drifted across the city, carrying with it the smell of burned plastic, metal, and something else, something no one wanted to name. The fire brigade declared it under control at 1:14 p.m., more than 12 hours after it began. But control did not mean extinguished. Hotspots would continue to burn for days, and the search for bodies would take weeks. The scale of the disaster was unprecedented in modern British history. 72 people confirmed dead, though the true number may never be known. Some victims were so badly burned that identification was impossible. Some may have been undocumented residents, people living off the grid, invisible in life and erased in death. Entire families were wiped out. 18 children under the age of 18. The youngest, Lena Belkadi, was just 6 months old. She died with her mother, Farah Hamdan, 29, on the 22nd floor. They had moved to London from Syria, seeking safety. The survivors faced a different kind of devastation. Hundreds were now homeless, their entire lives reduced to ash. Birth certificates, passports, photographs, heirlooms, all gone. Many had fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The borough's response was chaotic and inadequate. There was no central coordination, no clear information. Survivors were scattered across the city, housed temporarily in hotels, hostels, or with friends and family. They were given emergency payments, but no long-term plan. Some waited months, even years, for permanent housing. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors spoke of nightmares, of panic attacks triggered by the sound of sirens or the smell of smoke. Children drew pictures of burning buildings. Adults struggled with guilt, asking themselves why they survived when so many did not. In the immediate aftermath, the community did what the authorities failed to do. They organized within hours of the fire. Local mosques, churches and community centers became hubs of relief. The Al-Manar Mosque, just yards from the tower, opened its doors, providing food, shelter and support. Volunteers worked around the clock, sorting donations, preparing meals, offering comfort. The Notting Hill Methodist Church became a missing persons center, its walls covered with photographs of those unaccounted for. Desperate families came with flyers, hoping for news, any news. Many would never get it. The rage was palpable. People understood immediately that this was not a tragic accident. This was the result of decades of neglect, of austerity, of a system that valued profit over lives. Grenfell was in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, one of the richest areas in Europe. Yet its social housing was treated as disposable. The contrast was obscene. Streets away, oligarchs and bankers lived in mansions worth tens of millions. But the people of Grenfell were left in a building wrapped in flammable material to save a few £1,000s. Protests erupted within days. On June 16, hundreds marched on Kensington Town Hall, demanding answers, demanding justice. They stormed the building, refusing to leave until they met with council leaders. The council, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. The leader, Nicholas Paget Brown, appeared on television, offering condolences but little else. His words rang hollow. Within weeks, he would resign, along with other senior officials. But resignation was not accountability. It was an escape. The media descended on North Kensington. For weeks, Grenfell dominated every headline. Journalists interviewed survivors, firefighters, politicians. Documentaries were commissioned, investigations launched. But alongside genuine reporting, there was also exploitation. Cameras crowded grieving families. Reporters asked intrusive questions. The survivors, already traumatized, were forced to relive their nightmare again and again for public consumption. Some refused to speak. Others felt compelled to, hoping their stories would force change. The coverage was relentless, and then, as always, it faded. The news cycle moved on, but for those who lived through it, Grenfell never ended. The political response was immediate, but superficial. Prime Minister Theresa May visited the site the day after the fire. She met with emergency services, but avoided meeting survivors. The optics were disastrous. She appeared cold, detached, out of touch. A few days later she returned, this time meeting with residents, but the damage was done. In contrast, opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn visited on the first day, walking among survivors, listening, hugging, crying with them. The contrast was stark. It crystallized a broader truth, that the establishment had abandoned the working class, and Grenfell was the proof. May announced a public inquiry, led by retired Judge Sir Martin Morbick. The inquiry would examine the causes of the fire, the response, and the failures that led to it. But survivors and their advocates were skeptical. Morbick was seen as part of the establishment, a figure unlikely to challenge the system. They demanded a broader inquiry, one that examined social housing policy, austerity, and the culture of neglect. Their demands were partially met. The inquiry's scope was expanded, but many felt it still did not go far enough. The inquiry began hearing evidence in 2018, and would continue for years. Its findings were damning. The cladding installed on Grenfell Renbon PE with a polyethylene core was highly combustible. It had been chosen over a fire-resistant alternative to save money. The insulation behind it, Celotex RS5000, was also flammable and had been missold as suitable for high-rise buildings. The combination of the two created a deadly sandwich that turned the tower into a tinderbox. Building regulations had failed. They were outdated, confusing, and poorly enforced. Fire safety testing was inadequate, often manipulated by manufacturers to achieve desired results. The government had ignored warnings from fire safety experts for years. After a similar fire at Lakanal House in 2009, which killed 6 people, a coroner issued warnings about the dangers of combustible materials and the inadequacy of the stay-put policy. Those warnings were ignored. The inquiry also exposed the role of corporate greed. Companies that manufactured and sold the cladding and insulation knew the risks but prioritized profit. Internal emails revealed shocking cynicism. Executives joked about fire safety. They boasted about cutting costs. They manipulated tests to make their products appear safer than they were. Ryden, the contractor that carried out the refurbishment, had cut corners at every turn. The tenant management organization, responsible for managing the building, had dismissed residents' concerns with contempt. The council had approved the refurbishment without proper scrutiny, eager to improve the tower's appearance for the benefit of wealthier neighbors. The firefighters, meanwhile, were heroes and victims. They had fought with extraordinary courage, but they had been let down by their equipment, their command structure, and the building itself. Many suffered lasting trauma. Some left the service unable to continue. Others spoke publicly about the failures they witnessed, the lack of resources, the outdated training, the systemic problems that had endangered both them and the people they were trying to save. The stay-put policy, once a cornerstone of high-rise fire safety, was abandoned. The London Fire Brigade admitted it had taken too long to order a full evacuation. If the order had been given earlier, more lives might have been saved. But the firefighters on the ground had been operating with incomplete information, unaware that the building's cladding was turning it into a death trap. The search for bodies was harrowing. Specialist teams spent weeks combing through the wreckage, floor by floor. The heat had been so intense that some floors had collapsed into each other. Bodies were found fused together, families who had died holding each other. Identification was slow and painful. Forensic teams used dental records, DNA, personal effects. Some victims were never fully identified. The final death toll was confirmed at 72, but the emotional toll was incalculable. Funerals were held across the summer of 2017. Each one was a reminder of a life cut short, a future stolen. Khadija Say's funeral was attended by artists, activists, and friends. They remembered her warmth, her talent, her potential. Her work was displayed at the Venice Biennale as planned, a bittersweet tribute. Muhammad al-Hajj Ali was mourned by his fellow refugees and his university classmates. They spoke of his determination, his hope, his refusal to be broken by war, only to be killed by negligence. The Choucair family was buried together. 6 coffins, side by side. The images were unbearable. In the months and years that followed, the survivors organized. They formed the Grenfell United Group, a collective dedicated to ensuring their voices were heard, that the inquiry was thorough, and that justice was served. They campaigned for criminal prosecutions, for changes to building regulations, for an end to the use of flammable cladding on high-rise buildings. They won some victories. The government banned certain types of cladding and launched a program to remove it from existing buildings, though progress was painfully slow. As of 2024, thousands of buildings across the UK still had dangerous cladding. Residents lived in fear, unable to sell their homes, facing massive bills for remediation, trapped in the same neglect that killed 72 people. The calls for criminal charges grew louder. Survivors and families demanded that those responsible, the manufacturers, the contractors, the council officials, face prosecution for manslaughter. The police launched an investigation, Operation Northleigh, one of the most complex in British history. But justice was slow. Years passed with no charges. The legal system, designed to protect the powerful, seemed ill-equipped to hold corporations accountable. Survivors spoke bitterly of a two-tier justice system, where the poor were punished swiftly, but the rich and powerful evaded consequences. Grenfell also reignited debates about inequality, austerity, and social housing. For decades, successive governments had underfunded public services, sold off social housing, and deregulated industries in the name of efficiency. The result was a system that treated human lives as expendable. Grenfell was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper sickness. The fire exposed the contempt with which working-class communities were treated, the assumption that their safety was less important than cost savings or aesthetic concerns. It revealed the ways in which power insulated itself from accountability, how institutions closed ranks to protect their own. The tower itself remained standing for years, a haunting presence on the skyline. It was wrapped in a protective covering, white sheeting that made it look like a ghost. Plans for its future were debated endlessly. Some survivors wanted it demolished, unable to bear the sight of it. Others wanted it preserved as a memorial, a permanent reminder of what happened and why. Eventually, a decision was made. The tower would be carefully dismantled, and a memorial built in its place. But the process would take years, and in the meantime, the tower stood, a silent witness. On every anniversary of the fire, June 14th, the community gathered, a silent march, ending at the base of the tower. 72 seconds of silence, one for each victim. Green scarves and ribbons, Grenfell's color, worn by thousands, candles lit in windows across the city. The names of the dead read aloud, slowly, solemnly, so that each one was heard and remembered. Khadija Say, Muhammad Al-Haj Ali, Dennis Murphy, Nadia, Bassam, Mirna, Fatima, Sanab, and Seria Chukair, Gloria Trevisan, and Marco Gotardi. Sanab Dean, Isaac Palos, 72 names, 72 lives, each one mattered. The legacy of Grenfell is complex and unfinished. It is a story of failure, systemic, institutional, and moral. But it is also a story of resilience. The survivors refused to be forgotten. They fought for justice, for change, for a future where no one else would die because their lives were deemed less valuable. They built a community from the ashes, supporting each other through grief and trauma. They held the powerful to account, even when the powerful tried to evade responsibility. And they ensured that the 72 who died would be remembered not as statistics, but as people. People with dreams, families, futures. People who deserved better. People who should still be alive. The fire at Grenfell Tower was not inevitable. It was the result of choices. Choices to prioritize profit over safety. Choices to ignore warnings. Choices to cut costs and cut corners. Choices to treat certain lives as disposable. Every one of those choices had a name, a face, a position of power. And every one of those choices led, directly or indirectly, to the deaths of 72 people. The question that haunted Britain after Grenfell was simple and terrible. How many more will die before we learn? How many more fires? How many more disasters? How many more avoidable tragedies before the system changes? The survivors of Grenfell demanded an answer. They demanded that their suffering mean something, that the deaths of their loved ones lead to real change. Whether that change would come, whether justice would be served, remained uncertain. But one thing was clear. Grenfell would not be forgotten. The 72 would not be forgotten. And the fight for justice would continue until every last person responsible was held to account. June 14, 2017. A date seared into memory. A tower that became a tomb. A community that became a movement. 72 lives lost. Countless more shattered. And a city, a nation, forced to confront the ugly truth of its own inequality. Grenfell was a mirror held up to modern Britain. And the reflection was damning. The question now was whether anyone with power was willing to look. The deeper investigation into what went wrong revealed layers of failure so numerous, so interconnected, that it became clear Grenfell was not an accident waiting to happen. It was a disaster carefully constructed over decades. The public inquiry, which would eventually produce thousands of pages of testimony and evidence, painted a picture of a system so broken that the fire was almost inevitable. Every safeguard had failed. Every warning had been ignored. Every opportunity to prevent catastrophe had been squandered. The cladding was just the beginning. Rainabond PE, manufactured by the American company Arconic, had a polyethylene core that melted and burned at relatively low temperatures. Internal company documents revealed that executives knew the product was dangerous on tall buildings. They knew it had failed fire tests. Yet they continued to market it globally, including in countries with lax regulations like the United Kingdom. Sales representatives downplayed the risks. Marketing materials emphasized cost savings and aesthetic appeal. When questions were raised about fire safety, the company pointed to test results that had been manipulated or misinterpreted. In one infamous email, an archonic executive expressed concern about the cladding being used on high-rises, writing that it was dangerous and could lead to another Le Canal or Garnock court, references to previous fatal fires. The email was ignored. Sales continued. The insulation was equally culpable. Celotex RS 5000, manufactured by Saint-Gobain, was marketed as suitable for use on buildings over 18 meters tall. But the fire tests used to certify the product were fraudulent. The company had used a specific configuration in testing that did not reflect how the product would actually be installed. When used in combination with the Rainabond cladding, as it was on Grenfell, the insulation became a catastrophic fire accelerant. Internal emails showed that Celotex employees were aware their product did not meet safety standards, but proceeded anyway. One employee wrote that the test configuration was not representative of real-world use. Another joked about burning down buildings. The culture was one of casual indifference to human life, where profit margins mattered more than fire safety. Ryden, the main contractor for the refurbishment, bore enormous responsibility. The company had won the contract with a bid of £8.7 million, undercutting competitors by proposing cheaper materials and faster timelines. Throughout the project, Ryden prioritized speed and cost over safety. Subcontractors were pressured to cut corners. Fire safety consultants raised concerns but were overruled. The original design had included zinc cladding panels, which were less flammable. But Ryden and the tenant management organization agreed to switch to the cheaper aluminum composite material. The decision saved approximately £300,000. That saving cost 72 lives. During construction, workers noted problems. The cladding panels did not fit properly in places. Gaps were left unsealed, fire barriers were incomplete or incorrectly installed. But these issues were not addressed. The project was already over budget and behind schedule. Fixing the problems would have cost more time and money. The Tenant Management Organization, or TMO, was supposed to represent the interests of residents. Instead, it became an obstacle to their safety. The TMO was responsible for managing the building, for ensuring repairs were made, for listening to tenant concerns. It failed on every count. When residents complained about fire safety, the TMO dismissed them as troublemakers. When the Grenfell Action Group published their warnings, the TMO threatened legal action. When residents questioned the refurbishment, they were told to trust the experts. The TMO's leadership was insular, defensive, and hostile to criticism. Internal emails revealed a culture of contempt for the people they were supposed to serve. One senior manager referred to residents as rebels and militants. Another complained about having to deal with constant negativity. The TMO saw itself as under siege, rather than as failing in its duty. The Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea was the ultimate authority, and it was the ultimate failure. The council approved the refurbishment plans without proper scrutiny. Building control inspectors signed off on work that violated fire safety regulations. When residents raised concerns, the council deferred to the TMO. When the Grenfell Action Group published their blog posts, the council ignored them. The borough had a culture of austerity and privatization. Services were outsourced. Budgets were slashed. The TMO itself was a product of this philosophy, an arm's-length organization that allowed the council to distance itself from responsibility. But the council could not escape culpability. It had chosen to save money rather than invest in safety. It had chosen aesthetics over lives. The refurbishment was partly motivated by complaints from wealthier residents in nearby properties who found Grenfell an eyesore. The cladding was meant to make the tower more attractive, to blend it into the affluent neighborhood. The people inside were secondary. The government bore responsibility as well. For decades, successive administrations had deregulated the construction industry, trusting companies to self-police. Fire safety regulations had not been meaningfully updated since the 1980s. After the Lakanal house fire in 2009, a coroner issued a detailed report recommending changes to building regulations, sprinkler requirements, and the stay-put policy. The government received the report and did nothing. Ministers claimed they were reviewing the recommendations. Years passed, no action was taken. When Grenfell burned, the same failures that killed 6 people at Lakanal killed 72 at Grenfell. The government had also gutted local authority budgets through austerity policies. Councils had less money for inspections, for enforcement, for housing maintenance. Fire services were stretched thin, their budgets cut year after year. The London Fire Brigade had warned repeatedly that it was under-resourced, that it could not respond effectively to a major incident. Those warnings were ignored. The role of deregulation cannot be overstated. In the years leading up to Grenfell, the Conservative government had embarked on a campaign to reduce red tape in the construction industry. Ministers spoke openly about cutting regulations, about making it easier for developers to build, about reducing the burden on business. In 2014, the Housing Minister, Brandon Lewis, announced that the government would not be implementing new fire safety regulations for older buildings, dismissing concerns as unnecessary bureaucracy. That same year, another minister, Eric Pickles, wrote to local councils encouraging them to reduce building inspections. The message was clear: safety was less important than economic growth. Profit mattered more than people. The human cost of these failures extended far beyond the 72 who died. Hundreds of survivors were left with life-altering trauma. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing flashbacks, nightmares, and severe anxiety. Children who escaped the fire struggled in school, unable to concentrate, afraid to sleep. Parents who lost children could not function. Partners who lost spouses faced a future they had not imagined. The psychological scars were deep and permanent. Support services were inadequate. The NHS was already overstretched, and mental health care was a low priority. Survivors waited months for therapy. Some never received it. Community organizations stepped in, providing counseling and support groups, but they were overwhelmed. The scale of the trauma was beyond anything they had dealt with before. The financial impact was also devastating. Many survivors lost everything they owned. Insurance, if they had it, often did not cover the full extent of their losses. Replacing documents like passports and birth certificates was expensive and time-consuming, especially for refugees and immigrants who had to deal with bureaucratic hurdles. Finding new housing was a nightmare. The council promised to rehouse survivors within the borough, but there was not enough social housing available. Some were placed in hotels for months, living out of suitcases, unable to establish any sense of normalcy. Others were offered housing far from North Kensington, away from their community, their support networks, their children's schools. Many refused, preferring to stay in temporary accommodation rather than be displaced from the only home they knew. The fight for justice became all-consuming for many survivors. They attended every day of the public inquiry, sitting through hours of testimony, listening to experts dissect the failures that killed their loved ones. It was emotionally exhausting, but they felt they owed it to the dead to bear witness. They organized protests, lobbied politicians, spoke to the media. They became activists not by choice but by necessity. The system had failed them, and they could not trust it to fix itself without pressure. Grenfell United, the survivors group, became a powerful voice for change. They demanded criminal prosecutions, compensation, and reform. They rejected empty promises and platitudes. They wanted accountability. The inquiry itself was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it uncovered the truth, documenting in meticulous detail how and why the fire happened. On the other hand, it was painfully slow. Years passed with no criminal charges. Survivors felt like they were reliving the trauma over and over, forced to recount their experiences, to see photos of the burning tower, to hear recordings of desperate 999 calls. Some found the process cathartic, a way to ensure the truth was known. Others found it re-traumatizing and exploitative. The inquiry issued its first report in 2019, focusing on the night of the fire. It concluded that the stay-put policy had failed and that the London Fire Brigade's response had been inadequate. The second report, issued in 2024, examined the refurbishment and placed blame squarely on the companies, the TMO, and the council. It called for criminal prosecutions and sweeping reforms, but recommendations were not the same as action. The police investigation, Operation Northley, was one of the largest in British history. Detectives examined millions of documents, interviewed thousands of witnesses, and built cases against multiple individuals and organizations. But the complexity of corporate liability made prosecution difficult. Who was responsible? The executives who approved the cladding, the engineers who designed the refurbishment, the contractors who installed it, the inspectors who signed off on it, the council officials who approved it. Everyone pointed fingers at everyone else. No one accepted responsibility. The legal process dragged on for years. By 2024, some charges had been filed, but no major trials had taken place. Survivors spoke bitterly of a justice system that protected the powerful and punished the vulnerable. Meanwhile, the cladding crisis continued. After Grenfell, it became clear that hundreds of buildings across the UK were wrapped in similar flammable materials. Residents of these buildings, many of them leaseholders who had bought their flats, found themselves trapped. Their homes were unsellable. Insurance companies refused to provide coverage, and they were being asked to pay tens of thousands of pounds, sometimes hundreds of thousands, for remediation work. The government promised to fund the removal of dangerous cladding, but the program was slow and bureaucratic. Many buildings remained wrapped in the same materials that had killed 72 people at Grenfell. Residents lived in fear, sleeping with their windows open, keeping bags packed by the door, planning escape routes. Some could not afford to move. Others refused to leave, unwilling to abandon their homes. The cladding crisis became a national scandal, a constant reminder that the lessons of Grenfell had not been learned. The anniversary memorials became sacred rituals. Every June 14th, the community gathered to remember. The silent walk, a tradition that began in the weeks after the fire, wound through the streets of North Kensington, ending at the base of the tower. Thousands participated, wearing green, carrying photos of the dead, holding candles. At exactly 1 a.m., the time the fire started, 72 seconds of silence. The only sound was weeping. The names were read aloud, each one followed by applause, a sign of respect and solidarity. Survivors spoke, their voices breaking as they described the pain that never faded, the loved ones who never came home, the futures that were stolen. They demanded that the world remember, that the dead not be forgotten, that their suffering lead to change. The media attention fluctuated. In the immediate aftermath, Grenfell was everywhere. Documentaries, news specials, investigative reports. But as time passed, coverage diminished. Other stories took precedence. The survivors resented this, feeling like they were being forgotten, like Grenfell was old news. But they also understood the nature of the news cycle. They knew they had to keep fighting, keep speaking, keep reminding the world. Some survivors became public figures, giving speeches, writing articles, appearing on television. Others retreated, unable to bear the spotlight, struggling with their grief in private. There was no right way to survive Grenfell. Everyone coped differently. The tower itself remained a source of pain. For years, it stood wrapped in white sheeting, a ghost in the skyline. Plans for its future were debated endlessly. Some wanted it demolished immediately, finding its presence unbearable. Others wanted it preserved as a memorial, a permanent reminder of what happened. Architects proposed designs for a monument, but nothing felt adequate. How do you memorialize 72 lives? How do you create something that honors their memory without exploiting their deaths? The community was divided. Eventually, a decision was made to carefully dismantle the tower, a process that would take years and cost tens of millions of pounds. The site would become a memorial, designed in consultation with survivors and families. But the process was slow, delayed by legal issues and funding problems. The broader impact of Grenfell was profound. It changed the national conversation about inequality, austerity, and social housing. It exposed the two-tier system in which the rich and poor lived side by side, but in entirely different realities. It revealed the consequences of decades of neglect, of treating public services as expendable, of prioritizing profit over people. Grenfell became a symbol, invoked in debates about housing policy, corporate accountability, and government responsibility. It was a rallying cry for activists fighting for social justice. But symbols are not enough. The survivors wanted action, not speeches. They wanted justice, not sympathy. And as the years passed with little meaningful change, their frustration grew. 7 years after the fire, much had been said but little had been done. The inquiry had issued its reports. The police had filed some charges, the government had promised reforms, but dangerous cladding remained on buildings. Social housing was still underfunded. The same companies that contributed to the Grenfell disaster were still operating, still cutting corners, still prioritizing profit. The survivors continued to fight, exhausted but determined. They knew that Grenfell could happen again. They knew that without fundamental change, another community would suffer the same fate, and they refused to let that happen. They owed it to the 72. They owed it to themselves. They owed it to the future. Grenfell Tower was more than a building, It was home to a community, to families, to lives full of hope and struggle and love. When it burned, it took those lives with it. But it also revealed something essential about the world we live in. It showed us who we value and who we do not. It showed us what happens when we treat people as disposable, when we prioritize cost over safety, when we ignore the warnings of those without power. Grenfell was a preventable tragedy. Every death was avoidable. Every life lost was a choice made by someone, somewhere, who decided that saving money was more important than saving lives. That is the legacy of Grenfell. Not just the fire, but the choices that led to it. And until those choices are confronted, until those responsible are held accountable, until the system changes, Grenfell will not be an isolated tragedy. It will be a warning that went unheeded, a warning that will inevitably come true again.